couldn't think of a better title for this morning's lesson than Submit, Submit, Submit. No, I'm not talking for the government. That seems to be the battle cry of the government right now. Submit, submit, submit. But what we're going to teach you this morning regarding submittance, the government ain't doing. So this isn't, a lot of people, they just love to hold it over the women that you're in submission to the men. They love to they just love to lord over people. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. Jesus chimed in on it. Imagine that. Jesus chimed in on this subject. But first, just real quickly, a review from last week. We finished on verses 19 and 20. I think we started with verse 16 last week, if I remember right. But I'm just putting in the review, verses 19 and 20. In verse 19, rather than the King James Version, I'm using the easy-to-read version for verse 19. Encourage each other with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sing and make music in your hearts to the Lord. Now, in the King James, it speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs, spiritual songs. I don't know that I think you're going to see some commentaries that say one thing and some say the other. Regarding whether the easy-to-read version thinks of the Psalms as singing, just as singing them, or the songs and so forth. But I taught last week what I believe Paul's message is here. Psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Now, when they say hymns there, they're not talking about the stuff that's in our hymn book. Obviously, because this is written in the 1st century A.D. These hymn books. Now my mind's racing. But anyway, they are obviously written, some of them probably in 1800s, 1900s, and a few probably in the last century, which would have been the 1900s, come to think of it. But they're not what Paul had in mind here. But they are, and we don't know exactly what he probably, he mentioned Psalms, and probably had the idea of what was being sung when he was preaching. Whatever the music was that was being sung in church services. Now we do know some of them were psalms. Now David wrote about half of the Psalms. There's 150 Psalms. Most people think he wrote them all. I think he wrote just a little under half of them, if I remember right. I studied it one time, but I don't recall. There are a lot of other guys who wrote a few. This guy wrote a few, this guy wrote a few, that sort of thing. But they were songs. When David wrote them, he sang them. But all these centuries later, when Paul's talking, they didn't have psalms or song books from back when David wrote this stuff with the notes in there. So they probably, when he's talking about singing psalms, they probably do what we do today. Somebody will put music to a psalm. They'll read a psalm and put music to it today. And I've done that with a few scriptures. I don't know if I've done it to any psalms. But the thing I wanted to stress last week was that it's not just the beautiful melody. It's not even if you're singing an actual psalm. It's not even that it's the Holy Scripture you're singing. What's important is you understand what you're singing. There are people who've read the Bible through as a discipline. You have to read. I read it through 1 year. I had this plan that was given to me when I was a young man. and I read the scripture through, and you find yourself just reading. That's why I'd rather study the scripture. When you just read. I tell you, when you get in the book of Numbers, the 4th book in the Bible, they talk about how there were 12 tribes, and the tribe of Benjamin did this, and it lists the things they gave in an offering to God. And then it goes to the tribe of Judah. It lists the same thing, word for word, 12 times. And so modern translations, many of them just simply say, and each tribe gave this. It makes it easy, doesn't it, if they're all going to be the same. But the point is, when you just read, I'm a proponent of reading with the desire to understand what's written. You need to understand the words. Some of those Psalms are amazing. You know what David went through, what we go through. There were times he was as discouraged as could be. There were times he wanted to die. And there were other times where he was jubilant. And his Psalms reflect those things. So, when we sing here, you know that last song that I wrote, my eyes caught you there. I thought you were pointing something out to me. You're just scratching your baby's back. But anyway, till all I see is you. I don't know if it was the last one Angie did, Mirror and Me, I think. There's such neat words in some of this stuff. Pay attention. You can't worship the Lord in a song service if you're not understanding what's sung. The words are meant to lift your spirit to praise. So that's something Paul was teaching in the lesson we taught last week. Now, some people just love melodies. Some people on the radio, when they're in the car listening to songs on the radio, they're just looking for songs that have a pretty melody. And there are times good melodies can be a blessing. But the blessing you get from a good melody is over when the good melody is over. And I shared this verse last week in 1 Samuel 16:23. King Saul was the first king of Israel. The book of Judges is about God's preferred way for the government of Israel to work when they were a new nation. He wanted judges, not the way we use the word judge, but he didn't want kings. That wasn't his preferred order. But Israel opined for a king. They wanted to be like everybody else. And so the first king that God set up to be the king of Israel after the age of the judges. So you got the book of Joshua, and he's taken you through setting up the kingdom. And then you got Judges, and then you got what we call the 6 books of the Kings. Actually, there are 3 sets of 2. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. This is the history of Israel, and later after the division into 2 countries, Judah and Israel, and the kings they had. And kings aren't always good. Once the kingdom's divided, Saul, the first king, became a bad king. Started out a good king, became a bad king. David was a good king with flaws. That's the best you can hope for, is a good king with flaws, because none of us are perfect. Solomon, his son, started out a great king. God gave him peace with the enemies. But then he messed up. Have you ever read the Psalms, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes? If you ever read that book, there's a time to dance, there's a time to mourn, you know. That's written by Solomon, the wisest man to ever live outside of Jesus on this planet, it said. He knew stuff. But he got bored, and to find satisfaction, he investigated every avenue, including every avenue of sin. He writes at the end of, in chapter 12, he tells us throughout that book that I tried this and it didn't work. I tried this and it didn't work. And so you see him reflecting to a time when he was a backslider. Wasn't serving God, wasn't finding satisfaction anywhere. Had a great kingdom, living in peace with their neighbors. And he was miserable. But in chapter 12, the final chapter, this is what he concluded. Seek the Lord in the days of your youth. Get yourself grounded in God and don't move. And he spoke from experience because he moved. So anyway, we need to understand, I guess I got sidetracked. 1 Samuel 16:23 there came to pass. This Saul, that's where I got sidetracked. Saul, the first king, he just disobeyed God, and before you knew it, he was miserable. And so God anointed another king through the prophet, and that next king would be a lad called David. And if you wonder, when you think of that teenage boy going out to face a 9-foot giant, I don't think David was ever worried. Saul couldn't find anyone that would go out and fight Goliath. The Philistines said, we'll send our champion out, you send yours out, winner take all. If our champion kills your champion, you serve us. If your champion kills our champion, we'll serve you. Of course, you can never believe sinners. Couldn't get anyone to go, King Saul couldn't. He was the tallest guy in Israel, head and shoulders above everybody else, it said. Couldn't get anyone to go fight him. But David was there. He had some brothers, older brothers, that were soldiers, and he brought them some food from his parents' house. And he heard the giant come out and taunt. He said, I'll go fight him. And they were so desperate, they brought him to King Saul because no one would fight him. And King Saul said, you'll go? He said, yeah, I'm not afraid. He said, what do you mean? He said, I was watching my dad's sheep, and a lion came, and I killed the lion. And I forget a bear, was it? A bear came, and I killed the bear. He said, this giant will be like that lion and that bear. And so Saul tried to put some armor on him. But all the armor was too big for him. He said, no, I haven't tested this. I don't want that. I'll just go out. Stopped to get 5 smooth stones and marched right out to battle. And you know the rest of the story, killed the giant. But that King Saul became more and more wicked as Israel fell more and more in love with David. They chanted, Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. And so they all loved this young man as he grew into a young man. Saul wanted to kill him because Saul wanted David's best friend to be the next king, Jonathan. Jonathan protected David from his dad. An evil spirit would come upon Solomon sometimes. As you read the narrative, it doesn't sound like he was demon-possessed. This evil spirit would come and go. Here's what made it go sometimes. David would play the harp. I say all that to say sometimes music, just the melody, can do something. But if you want lasting results, you got to understand the message of things. You got to understand, I shared last week, you got to understand what's being taught. You got to understand what the songs you love are saying. Words have meaning. And we need to understand those words. Now this week, now we're going into submission. Submitting yourself one to another in the fear of God. In regards to that word submitting, according to Strong's Greek Dictionary, it means to subordinate, effectively to obey. So is submission really a part of the Christian experience? 1 Corinthians 11:3 says, "But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God." Jesus has a head. This Jesus of whom John wrote in the first chapter, everything that is made was made by him. That guy submitted to his Father. And so we see, we're going to show you certain areas where the Bible teaches submittance. It said every man should submit to Christ, and I left the next part off for now, and Christ submits to God. Ephesians 5:24, the first part of it. Therefore, as the church is subject to Christ. So we see that the church, not this local setting, but the church as a whole, God's children everywhere, are to be subject to Christ. We all get that. That's not an issue to us. It might be an issue in practice. We might not always practice submission to Christ, but we understand the concept that we ought to be subject to Christ. So, Romans 13, he got into the idea of policing. There are modern translators who render the word higher powers to policemen. But here's what Romans 13 says. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Doesn't mean there aren't unsaved people with power, but it means the structure of power is a God-given structure. When used right, it is a blessing, not a curse. Verse 2, therefore, whosoever therefore resists the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So, what it says, I got to correct myself. Modern translations don't render policemen for that part, the beginning of it, but those that are carrying out the instructions of the law to keep people in order, it uses the word policeman in some of the modern translations. So when a cop tells you to pull over, you should probably not try to outrun him. You should probably pull over. And not only to save yourself a lot of trouble, because it's a godly thing to do. We are instructed to submit to the higher powers. And just let me, so I don't forget, I had put this off till a little later, but then I might forget it. People say, what if my government tells me to do something that is contrary to what God's telling me to do? It starts off in this verse by saying, be subject to the higher powers. Who's the highest power, my government or my God? So if I have to choose between obedience, you go to the highest power. So if my government is telling me, when you go home today, beat the tar out of your wife, I'm going to study till I can find a reason not to do that, because she'd kill me. But anyway, wouldn't be a fair fight. She'd take me every time. The point is, it never tells you that stuff. It never tells you to hurt people. Good governments, there are bad governments over. You know, when Paul's writing some of this stuff, guess who the emperor is? Nero. One of the most wicked emperors ever. Nero was such a wicked, evil person, when he would throw one of his big shindigs and they would have an orgy, he would put oiled rags on Christians, tie them to a post or whatever, and set them on fire so they could see while they were enjoying their orgy. That's Nero. One of the most wicked people that ever stepped foot on this planet. Paul is writing during his reign. And he said, be subject to the higher powers. So as long as those higher powers of government aren't telling you to disobey the Scripture, and that could happen soon here in the United States. There are politicians right now that want to take your right to have any money you donate to church, an evangelical church, not be tax deductible, because they say that evangelical churches are just really Republicans. That's all they are, just Republicans. And therefore their giving to them shouldn't be tax deductible. You know what? They can say whatever they want. Most people don't give money to the church to get a tax deduction. They give it to help the ministry of God. So, fooey with them. We don't care. But the bottom line is this. We ought to be subject to the higher powers and understand that he's not saying that God has put Nero, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying he didn't. But this main emphasis here isn't that he set Nero in power of Rome. We don't know, there's scriptures that tell us that kings rise and fall and that God's involved in all of it, but if the plan of God involves that, we just don't have enough to really definitively say. But we do know that the structure of having a king is set up by God. The structure in our country of having a government is set up of God. That said, King Saul became a bad king. People staying in Washington, D.C. for 30, 40, 50 years is crazy. And they become a little more wicked every year because they never want to give up their power. That's crazy. But whenever we can, we are to submit to the higher power until that submitting to them infringes on my ability to submit to God. We always submit to the higher powers. All right, so look down here at 1 Peter at the bottom. Submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So he said the structure is the structure, and whenever possible, submit to it. Now you say, how can you keep saying whenever possible? It doesn't say that here. Because when Peter and John were brought before the high priest, when they prayed for the cripple at the entrance to the temple, and a man who had been born cripple jumped and ran and sang away from there healed. They called them in to question him, and basically, the end of the story, they brought the man healed before this was a different story when Jesus healed a blind man. They brought him in before them and talked to him, and he said, here's the only thing I can tell you. I don't know who this guy is. All I know is before he prayed for me, I was blind. After he prayed for me, I see. And that's the good news of the gospel. God can change your life. If it's not drastically and physically, he'll change it in other areas. But nonetheless, and again, I keep stressing it, whenever possible, we ought to obey the law, as long as it doesn't infringe on our obedience to Christ. Now look at Hebrews 13:17. Obey them that have rule over you, and submit yourself, for they watch for your souls, so that they must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. You don't hear this much. I'm going to say something. Give me time before you get mad at me. That verse is primarily saying that the leaders of the church, you need to listen to them. Now, this isn't like government. It's a spiritual government. But it's not telling you for the same reason. It's saying the guy that's going to get judged for what you know is the guy teaching you. So pay attention. That's basically what he's saying there. So, and we hate this word submit. But it says submit one to another. That involves all of us, right? Submittance is not a bad word. I tell you what, if the Russians attacked, and Barb and I run into the woods and run into, anybody around here know anything about living in the wild? Oh, right there. If we run into Jeff, and Barb and I say, let's go this way, and Jeff says, no, let's go this way. And you realize he's probably been that way about 100,000 times. We probably ought to submit, because he might be the guy that helps us escape the Russians that are walking through the jungle looking for us with machine guns. So, the point is, there are times to submit. Now, here's one of the arguments. I got to start speeding this up. Here's one of the arguments, people, because I left that part of the verse out, but I'm going to jump into it now. I put dashes and took a certain part out because I wanted to get to a different area of the message before I brought it out. The Scripture teaches that wives ought to submit to their husbands. And that's offensive to the women's movement. Let me share a few things on this with you. The idea of submittance, again, is not a bad thing. Everybody submits. Everybody. If you got a job, you got a foreman who might be a tobacco-chewing, whiskey-drinking guy who's on his 7th wife, who's beaten up 16 people that he fired, he might be your boss. He doesn't deserve necessarily your respect in one sense. He deserves your respect as being the one that can fire you. But nonetheless, he said, today I want you to go over to that part of the factory and work there. You submit to that. He's the boss. You might not care for him. You might not want to run into him at Village Inn. But at work, you understand he's the boss. Here's why I'm stressing this. You submitting to your boss doesn't make your boss better than you. This is where we get submission all screwed up. We think, are you saying that the husband better than the wife? Of course not. I tell you what, if I had to make a bet, I'd say about 85% of the wives are probably better people than the husbands. It's just, I think a lot of them have a softer spirit. Although, I'm not sure about my wife. This is going to embarrass her. It's horrible. She told me she never cried when old Yeller died. I hate watching Hallmark movies with her because every time there's a tender moment, she looks over at me to see if she can catch me doing this. Is that right? And if she's not sure, she said, are you crying? And wives tend to be, I mean, there are some tremendous men on this planet. But the bottom line is, submittance has nothing to do with who's the better person. There's a structure. I've taught this before. I don't think wives being subject to their husband means that you got to get permission from your husband if you want to go shopping with a friend. Primarily what I see wives submitting to a husband is this. If one of you wants to move to Florida and the other one wants to move to California, if somebody doesn't have the God-given final authority, the marriage ends. Because one of you is going to go here and one of you is going to go here. Marriage is an important thing to God because it is a picture of the relationship of Christ with the church. And God values marriage. And so He gives somebody the final decision when decision can't be reached by discussion. Now I think, and the first thing to do is sit down and talk about it. What are the advantages of moving here? What are the advantages of moving here? And if you still are divided on the issue at the end, someone has to have the final say. Otherwise the marriage is over. The wife submitting to her husband does not make her inferior to her husband in any way, any shape, or any form. Again, as I've already said, in many cases, I don't know, I doubt there's been any survey taken, but I would say well over half in marriages the woman's a nicer person than the husband. Except in our marriage, she doesn't cry. I sit there enjoying a Hallmark movie, and there she is. Anyway. But I want you to understand that. Everybody submits. Submittance has nothing to do with who's better than who. Now, having said that, let me show you the other side of submittance. How many of you think Jesus knew what He was talking about? Matthew 20, beginning with verse 25. Oh. By the way, Peter, above that in 1 Peter, has shared that there's a certain kind of submittance you need for the pastors of the churches because they're going to give an account to God for your souls. But then Peter instructs the preachers and said, don't lord it over your people. Serve them. But now listen to what Jesus says. Jesus called them unto Him. He's talking about His disciples in Matthew 20:25. Jesus called them unto Him and said, you know that the princes of the Gentiles, the political entities in the world of the various governments where non-Jews were living, the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. So, He's saying, you know there are structures out here where the people in power are in power for their benefit, not the people's benefit. And then He goes on to say in verse 26, but it shall not be so among you. So He's telling His disciples, when I'm out of here and you're doing the thing I've called you to do, that's not how I want you to operate. That's not the way it's going to be in my church, Jesus is in essence saying. Verse 26, it shall not be so among you, but whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. Now, it's not talking about this type of thing, minister. It's talking about the person who ministers to you. I minister to you here, the Word of God. But He's talking here about servants who take care of their masters. So, He's saying, in this Gentile community, the people with authority lord it over the people they have authority over. He said, that's not how it's going to be in mine. He said, if you want to be great in my kingdom, you serve the people I put you in front of. And then listen to what He said. And whosoever will be chief among you must be your servant. There we said it again. But he said it somewhere. I guess I didn't bring that. I needed to put another verse in there. But Jesus put it this way: even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister. Jesus was not saying, in the Greek, he was not saying, I didn't come to be preached to, I came to preach. That's the way we use minister in the church. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, I did not come here so you could wait on me hand and foot. I came out here to meet your needs. I came here to serve you. So if we're offended by the concept that I have to yield to the foreman at work, to my boss, then we're not getting the concept that Jesus is teaching. He said, that's why I came. I am your Lord, but I came to serve. And boy, did he serve. So Jesus has a principle: you that I give authority, whether it's in the structure of the home, the husband has authority over the wife, the husband and wife have authority over the children. You don't just live in this reality of authority, but you submit to the needs of your family and find a way to meet them. Now, just so Max doesn't use this against you, Angie, I said needs, not wants. We'll differentiate those two things. Remember that next time you go to the store with him, Lucky. But anyway, he's getting his list out right now. The bottom line is, being a guy that has, and not only do we all submit to somebody, the guys who don't submit to anybody end up dead quicker. I tell you, if you're in the military, I wish they quit teaching critical race. What a horrible place. China's not teaching critical race theory to their soldiers. Our soldiers might be facing their soldiers one day. They're teaching their soldiers how to kill better. I tell you, I don't want anyone to be prejudiced against anyone. But when the people trying to defend me are out fighting the people trying to defend China, I want them to be better killers than the Chinese soldiers. That's what I want. Because if there ever comes the day where we're at war and we get into the physical soldier against soldier and not just pushing buttons, I want our guys to come home. And teaching them that they ought to feel bad because they're white or they ought to feel oppressed because they're black has nothing to do with getting them ready to shoot that gun and come home. So, but anyway, the whole idea is I have other scriptures. There's all kinds of scriptures here. But here's the thing I want to bring out in closing. I mean, about the younger submitting to the elder. There's just so many areas. I tell you, there's a girl, Angie, at the high school. I start work 4 days a week at 3 o'clock. Wednesday's called early out. The kids get out an hour early, so I get to go in at 2. And so 4 days a week, I work from 3 to 7, 1 day a week, 2 to 6. And there's this girl, man, she's little. I tell you, I like this girl. I told her the other day, I have a grandson in this school. But I think you're my second favorite student here. I think Max ought to marry her. I tell you, she's an itty-bitty thing. Really. At least 3 times a week for the last 6 weeks. At least 3 times a week. When I pull up and park out in front, she's over here somewhere and I'm scanning and I don't catch her. And then all of a sudden I see someone moving. I thought, there she is. Wherever she's at waiting for her ride to show up, when she sees me walk, because I'm old, she heads to that door. And she knows that I'm going to put, I go through the window of McDonald's every day, and I'm going to put my empty sack, because I ate the food on the way there, in the garbage right by the door. I'm walking up that wide sidewalk, and there she is with the door open. Every day. You marry that girl, you're in trouble. Every day. I tell her every day, I can't believe how kind you are. Thank you so much. And she said, you're welcome. That's it. Not looking for a handout. I don't want your compliment. $10, please. Not. Parents evidently taught her to be kind to the old. I don't know. But I tell you, she submits to my needs 3 to 4 times every week. And the time she doesn't, her ride got there early because I don't see her anyway. It's an amazing, amazing thing. I want to meet her parents. It's amazing. Nice young lady. And I prophesy that Max is going to marry her. Not in the name of the Lord, though, so you're off the hook. But anyway, what a serving... You know, when I'm pushing garbage out of the school, I got to go by down the area nowadays by the basketball area and the weight room, and there's always teenagers there, either coming to get ready to play volleyball or to play basketball or to go to the weight room, and none of them make eye contact with me. And but if any of them are by that back door when I'm ready to pull my cart through that back door to take the garbage out, those who won't make eye contact with me and say, hi here, open that door for me. I tell you, it just blows me away sometimes. I told this one young teen, I'm assuming, I forget what time of the year, he played basketball or something. I said, will you tell your parents when you get home tonight that I think they did a great job raising you? I just, and I got a smile. Girls that play volleyball do the same thing. If they're by that door when I'm coming, they open it for me. So they don't make any contact with me, eye contact any other time. That's not cool to say hi to the janitor. I get it. But it's cool to open the door for the janitor. This I've learned. All right. So anyway, here's the idea with submitting. On the one hand, God gave me authority over my wife. On the other hand, here's what He told me to do with that authority. Serve her. Serve her. Find out what her needs are and meet them. When you understand biblical doctrine on submission, it cannot be viewed as offensive unless you simply want to be offended. Bottom line, Jesus Himself said, I didn't come to be waited on, I come to wait on you. He used the word serve. And that's the good news of the gospel. Jesus is in every way, according to Philippians chapter 2, equal to the Father. He's in every way equal to the Father. Yet the Father is His head. There is nobody on this planet that is better than me. And there's nobody on this planet that I'm better than. They all have the same worth to God that I do. Now, some of them might need to be locked up in prison until they find Jesus because they hurt people. But the bottom line is, God died for that guy's soul too. His soul has the same value mine does.